I am of the opinion that decline of the Stanley was inevitable, that it was going to happen with or without the lead. You know, women's interests are quite often viewed as frivolous. I think that energy is what is coming to a lot of critiques of the Stanley. Women be crazy. Women be shopping. Like, women are bad with money. Women, women. People didn't think about practicality when they were buying the Stanley because it was never about the Stanley. People understood these problems when they bought their second, third, or fourth Stanley because it was never about the Stanley. We now have reasons to overconsume and overbuy alternative water bottles. That is what's happening. People are exchanging one water bottle for another. The Stanley rose to prominence and fell from grace, and neither of these happened because of the product category itself. Hey y'all, welcome in or welcome back to the channel and a new video. Today we are talking about the Stanley. This is not your average Stanley video. Yes, we are going to address the craze that has surrounded the Stanley, but today we are talking about the rise and the decline of the Stanley. I'm going to talk about why I think it's dying down and why its die down isn't perhaps what it might be up front. We're going to talk about the gendered nature of consumption. We're also going to be looking at some TikTok clips. It's going to be a pop-in video, and I personally think that the Stanley is just such an interesting little case study, an interesting microcosm of consumerism that I find personally fascinating, and I could watch 1,000,005 of these videos. So if you would like to hear my take on it, then I hope you'll keep watching. Would also love it if you would subscribe to catch more consumer culture content. So a few months ago, there was a lot of coverage on the absolute craziness of a Stanley release. So back in January, there was a Valentine's Day release, and people were clamoring over this release. There were tramplings. There were, maybe not tramplings, there were people rushing the store, running through the store to get their Stanley cups. The reaction to these releases were kind of insane because of all of the footage that came out of people rushing the displays or rushing Starbucks, attempted thefts, the pushing and the shoving, and they were being analyzed and critiqued for peak consumerist behavior. Target never expected these releases to go the way that they did. I don't think people anticipated the public's reaction, and so Target and Starbucks were kind of unprepared for said reaction. So Target and Starbucks learned from this release, and they created new policies and programs for a release that happened in April, just like 2-ish months later. There was an expectation that this Mother's Day release would be just as big as the previous releases or the previous release, and it wasn't. The January releases, people snapped up cups in seconds, minutes, really. Like, entire displays were cleared out in 2 to 3 minutes, and people were reselling online very quickly. The Mother's Day release, that didn't happen. There wasn't the same kind of attention. People weren't running for these displays. There were fewer people who turned out, and I think that caught everybody by surprise. Back in January, resellers were a big problem because people would go to their Target and their Starbucks. They would buy these cups, multiple if they could, and then they would resell them online immediately. Some people tried to charge $1,000 for these. You were seeing people list them at $200 or $400, double or triple the price of the original cup. There's also people who were doing raffles where you had to pay a certain amount of money to get into the raffle to get a chance to win a Stanley. And Kiki Chanel covered this. And if you like the Stanley coverage or the Stanley discussion, her video on the Stanley is super interesting. Overall, I'm just not a fan of this type of reselling because it's intentionally trying to price gouge people. It's intentionally trying to liquidate stock so people can't get their hands on it and they're forced to purchase these items through the secondhand market. I don't love it. I don't love the intention behind it. People were price gouging in the first release. The same people did the same thing in the second release, only to find out that people could still get their hands on the stuff in store and it wasn't as desirable as the early release. There wasn't the same kind of scarcity, so price gouging couldn't happen. Now, the commentary that appeared on these kinds of videos was a bit like, we're trampling people for water bottles. And I think people outside of the Stanley community really saw the hyperconsumption, and there was a lot of judgment about the absurdity of this behavior for consumer goods.
Now, listen, I can appreciate and love the fact that this father is just wanting to do whatever it takes to make his daughter happy. But I can also understand how cultish it is to wait outside a Target parking lot when it is freezing cold and you've been there for hours on end with no sleep and you're getting food delivered to you outside just so that you don't lose your place in line. And again, the amount of people outside lining up for this is crazy. And the fact that an actual employee of the store has to come out and give rules and regulations and tell people how to behave when they get in the store is, again, even crazier. But it doesn't end there, because there were also legitimate fights breaking out at these Targets over these Stanley Cups. Because there was, yet again, a fully grown adult person who participated in this madness by trying to steal an entire box of these cups. But what I do care about is the fact that the guy recording this person stealing these bottles is saying, "A loser." Do you have any self-awareness? In line in the freezing cold for hours on end for this cup. And yet, you're going to call this man a loser for doing something more efficiently than you are. Thankfully, there are still some sane individuals left on this planet, because everyone was like, all of this for a cup? Really? But after getting their hands on this ridiculous cup, there were people who, for a lack of a better term, not mentally well. Because tell me why there are grown adults out there who are preserving the label of this cup. Why are you tearing this off so carefully?
After I saw the most recent launch, my first thought was, oh my God, is the Stanley craze dying out? Did we realize that maybe we went a little too crazy? Maybe we shouldn't have trampled people or hit people or attempted to steal things from people or price gouge people. Like, did we have that moment? Did we realize about the hyperconsumption that was happening here? Before we go further, I do want to say, if you're somebody who has a Stanley, who likes it, do not let me or people critiquing the Stanley or consumer behavior talk you out of enjoying this thing that you already bought. In my opinion, one of the reasons that contributed to the decline in the Stanley between January and April were the stories that came out about the lead. Now, lead is used in the process that helps insulate the cup, and people were doing at-home lead testing kits, and it led to a bit of a panic. People feeling like their Stanleys were unsafe or throwing out their Stanleys for those reasons. Now, I think that this contributed to the decline to some respect, but I ultimately believe, I am of the opinion that decline of the Stanley was inevitable, that it was going to happen with or without the lead. The hype over the Stanley was never about this specific product or this specific water bottle. It was about the symbol of the cup. It was about micro trends. It was about people being sold an aesthetic or a lifestyle, and the Stanley representing that. The Stanley Cup is at the end of the day, a practical item. You know, trends aside, consumer culture aside, a water bottle is a practical item. It's a vessel to drink water out of that is reusable. And in this case, because it's double-walled insulated, it will keep your beverage hot or cold. This is practical. It's designed to last for years and it's extremely sturdy. As a product category and a brand, you know, Stanley is probably one of the more practical things that consumer culture could kind of get its hands on because of all of the water drinking kind of stuff I was talking about. But also when you think about the brand or when you look at the brand, they are a brand that's associated with the outdoors, with kind of like camping and hiking and outdoor adventure. But the brand as a brand identity is the opposite of hyperconsumption. Here's what the brand says about their own products. They say the most sustainable products are the kind that never need to be thrown away or replaced. Stanley has created reusable, built-for-life products for over 100 years, reducing demand for disposable products that end up in waste and water streams. However, just because a brand stands for that thing doesn't mean that the consumers have to purchase with this intention. And it might draw on people who are interested in environmentalism. But that doesn't guarantee that the Stanley will appeal exclusively to those kinds of people. Stanley doesn't get to gatekeep who purchases them and who doesn't. It's not like Adidas refuses to sell people running shoes if they're not going to run in them. That's not how it works. I highlight the brand identity because I don't think it was the brand identity that drew people to the Stanley. If the brand identity was a contributory factor to drawing people to the cup, it probably wouldn't draw the folks who were interested in collecting 20 cups. The behavior that emerged around the Stanley is hyper-consuming behavior. It became something or another thing to consume, another thing to demonstrate aesthetics or wealth, or for things to become micro trends or things to signal belonging or it girl status. The definition of consumer culture is when the consumption of goods and services is a central aspect of people's lives and identities. In consumer culture, purchasing and owning products are not just practical activities, but also symbolic ones, influencing social status, identity formation, and lifestyle choices. Consumer culture turns the acquisition of stuff into a hobby and also into identity formation, as well as central components to people's identities and lives. The Stanley Cup was consumer culture-ified. Purchasing the Stanley meant something that had nothing to do with drinking water. Here is an excerpt from the cut about the Stanley in middle schools. The tumblers have particularly taken off among preteen girls, launching something of a cup-based social hierarchy in middle and even elementary schools, especially after students return from winter break with their shiny new Stanleys they receive for holiday presents. I'm like a little bit more popular now, and I've been getting more friends because of it, says Madeline, a 9-year-old in Kentucky who owns 5 Stanleys. Her 16-year-old sister has 15 of them and more on the way. Some take it even further and accessorize their accessory with add-ons from snack trays to phone products to decorative charms. This is one example of how a Stanley has become a status symbol and a symbol within a school of it girl status, cool girl status, because she owns this cool thing. And you can purchase your way into popularity via owning this item. Each generation has had their equivalent of this. And I think probably multiple across generations, because this kind of stuff happens every year or every few years. I remember back in like the mid 2000s, Fat Farm shoes were it status. Also, eventually, later on, Ugg boots, Lululemon pants, the flare pants were... The Ugg boots live rent-free in my head as the ultimate it girl status, or not so much I believe that, but I remember that so vividly from my youth. because it was everywhere and actually lasted a really long time. There were also the slap bracelets and also the plastic, like the really thin plastic bracelets. Those didn't last long. And I'm sure when I was younger, there were different toys and such as well. In my opinion, there's a veneration of wealth and materialism that does come along with the Stanley. Not only can you afford a $50 or $60 drinking vessel when there are more affordable and cheaper options out there, but you can also afford all of the other things that come along with it. You can afford the charms and the holders. You can also afford to own multiple drink caps and all of that. The Stanley, in my opinion, is just such a good example of consumer culture because of how deeply it has penetrated society. It affected different kinds of people. It affected children, teens, and adults. And it kind of has become a part of our cultural zeitgeist. Like everybody has heard about the Stanley. And when something becomes so consumer cultureified, you get the backlash. You get the people who don't want to buy the Stanley because the Stanley is so popular, which I think only really happens when something reaches a height of popularity. This is the thing about symbols, is that they can be absolutely anything. To me, the Ugg boots is perhaps an even worse example of this because at the time, Uggs were like $200. $200 in 2009? Are you kidding me? To buy like children and teens is just wild to me. There was so much pressure to buy and own the Ugg boots. And it wasn't just any Ugg boot. It was the midi length brown Ugg boot. That was the boot. And people would, like, you could be ostracized or looked down upon for not owning the Ugg boot. You had a sense of belonging if you did own it. And I think maybe what might kind of make the Stanley a little bit more interesting is that it's perhaps more accessible in that, I mean, when you compare a $200 boot versus a $50 water bottle, I'm not saying that $50 is cheap, but when something is more affordable than this $200 Ugg boot, then there are more people who have the opportunity to participate. And I think more people can justify a water bottle than an Ugg boot. When it comes to adults, there is an element of fitting in and this desire for aesthetics and it girl status. We might not be bullying each other like the 9-year-old in Kentucky, but there are like hierarchies out there and people who will get more of a following or who kind of dictate trends in ways like the 9-year-old in middle school. And I also think eventually with stuff, sometimes we get so curious about something, like something is so hyped, we eventually want to try it ourselves. Want to be like, okay, let me see what the hype is about. I've been there. I've absolutely done this with makeup products and even clothing brands. I got sucked into Morphe back in the day. I wanted to know what all the internet girlies were saying about Morphe. It happened with NYX. I paid an arm and a freaking leg to ship many makeup products to me to Canada when they weren't readily available in Canada. I wanted to have what the other girls had. I wanted to try the things that they said were good. The Stanley is also such a really good item for a micro trend because there are so many colors. And Stanley, in my opinion, kind of leaned in to its micro trend because they did start sponsoring creators and they did create these limited edition collaborations to kind of get that fervor. And all of these colors and limited edition collections really helped perpetuate a collect 'em all mentality. I think it just contributed to their appeal. People call those who have overconsumed the Stanleys mindless consumers. And I don't really think that's fair because I do think that, yes, there is a chance that people get caught up in the hype, but people go out of their way to collect this stuff. And I don't think you can really be mindless when you're collecting. I also think that the way that women have been treated in the Stanley craze has or is a result of long held beliefs about women and money. This perceived frivolousness of women and money. And it's become a way, in my opinion, to denigrate women. I think that it's become a way to denigrate women because women are the primary collectors of Stanleys or the primary purchasers of Stanleys. We typically don't call stamp collectors or even Pokemon collectors or sports memorabilia collectors mindless consumers. One of the reasons why people apply the term here or kind of see this as a negative is because Stanleys were never intended to be collected. This is a product category that doesn't necessitate multiple iterations of the thing. And so owning multiple is a bit antithetical to the product category and the product itself. When something is meant to last a lifetime, like this product, that is factored into the manufacturing of the item, the price as well, like the ingredients, the materials used for the product. And Nalgene, as an example, is a plastic water bottle. I don't think people expect their Nalgenes to last a lifetime, whereas Stanleys and others like it, maybe we don't expect it to last a lifetime, but we expect it to last years, if not decades. But the Stanley in specific, we might have higher expectations given their kind of lifetime promise. I also think that some of the critique of this collecting aspect of things, when you compare it to other product categories like stamp collecting or Pokemon collecting, the Stanley is being collected because it is popular of the moment. Whereas even within kind of other niches, there might be certain kinds of coins or certain kinds of cards that are limited edition that are made now, or certain kinds of cards that resurgence or have a resurgence in popularity. That's kind of maybe trends within a collecting niche, but people overall aren't collecting Pokemon cards for a year and then stop. People are collecting Stanleys, in my opinion, or they will be collecting them for a brief window in time. They're collecting them for a year or two, and then they will discard them and then collect something else. So it's not really a collection, but somebody acquiring a lot of goods. And just because you own a lot of something doesn't make that thing a collection. And I perhaps would have less problems personally with the collecting mentality if folks actually wanted to collect them and hold on to them for years, but people are only collecting them in the sense of acquiring a lot of things that they don't actually intend to own for years. So it does become overconsumption when we start decluttering them because we bought too much. While I think that there are valid criticisms of the Stanley, the consumer culture behind the Stanley, and the collecting of the Stanley, I don't think all of these criticisms are okay or are coming from good places. The Stanley Cup has received widespread critique and commentary, even being captured from regular kind of news outlets and not just internet commentary people. And I want to touch on this critique now because I am somebody who is participating in a critique. In my opinion, women's consuming habits tend to get much more focus and criticism than men's. This is in part due to the things that women tend to consume and the social opinions of those said things, as well as women. You know, women's interests are quite often viewed as frivolous, and therefore spending on them is also frivolous, while not bringing that same kind of attention and energy to men's spending. According to the femme world, men spend more money than women on average, which is about, on average, $2,000 more a year. Women tend to make more impulse purchases than men, but men tend to spend more on impulse purchases. There are tons of myths out there about women being bad with money. And even things like girl math help perpetuate these myths. And there are some valid historical reasons why women may be less financially literate or educated than men, given that things like access to credit have only been extended to women without the presence of a husband in our parents and or grandparents' lifetimes. And so men tend to spend larger sums of money at once. So they're overall buying fewer things, but they're spending more on the things that they are buying. These things tend to be less criticized. Things like, electronics tend to be less criticized and seen as more serious, or real hobbies like building a computer. I think a man who spends $3,000 building a computer is going to get far less flack, if any, than a woman who spends $3,000 on Stanleys and accessories. The computer is seen as a real hobby. And it's these interests that contribute to these discourses that we can put maybe consumer goods aside. Let's talk about things like golf, going to the bar. These are very traditional ways that men spend money, whereas women going to the hair or nail salon is frivolous. I think there's valid critiques of both, but not, in my opinion, on the aspect of frivolousness. How men and women are spoken to about money is also different. There was a study that was conducted about the gendered language around money. It found that 65% of financial articles in women's magazines categorize women as excessive spenders. Of those aimed at men, 70% emphasized making money. Women are told to cut back on coffee to save up for new pairs of shoes. With men, money is all about power suits and investing in long-term goals, supercars and yachts, and people looking quite smug. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, women spend more than men on apparel, but men spend far more on other things like takeout alcohol and cars. Overall, single men spend slightly more than women, but they may also do this because they out-earn women. Frivolous spending has nothing to do with gender. Nevertheless, the myth of the frivolous spender still exists. This is perhaps its own video on the myth of the frivolous spender, and I think that when we critique spending, that we can critique consumer culture and we can critique influencers without turning it into denigrating women or their interests. I think that energy is what is coming to a lot of critiques of the Stanley. Women be crazy. Women be shopping. Women are bad with money. Women. I hate that energy, and I think some of that is responsible for the critique. There are plenty of men out there who are reviewing electronics and other kinds of equipment or video games, and you don't have to be a man to have any of these interests. You don't have to be a man to golf. Let's be clear. But that does not get the same kind of energy or critique as women's interests. And I do think that perhaps one of the reasons why I'm critiquing consumer culture is because I was somebody who was drinking the Kool-Aid and who is now critiquing from experience within the niche. And I think far less of that is happening with men. And also when men are commentary, they kind of tend to be more like make money. In my opinion, I'm just personally speaking, I have a problem with overconsumption, and if I were to ever critique men's interests, this channel would not turn into make more money, because making more money is not the problem. Rampant overconsumption, runaway capitalism is the problem. There's so much critique of the Stanley and women's behavior in regard to the Stanley. I think a lot of it is coming from a place of the frivolous spender and also ingrained misogyny. And I think that in some respects, women are treated as unserious and frivolous no matter what they buy. I do think that consumer culture does affect men and women differently, not because of some kind of biological essentialism. No. I think it affects them differently because of the messages about money and finance that each gender receives and the kinds of products and services that are targeted at them as well. So back to the Stanley. There was no moment of reckoning because what happened is that people just moved on to another water bottle. You have the Awalas that are popular. You also have the hydro jugs, the simple human mugs.
You need an Awala. And I was like, I don't need another water bottle. I have 9 Stanleys. No, like, this is literally where it's at.
Why is there need?
Okay, let me tell you about
It's a little too small though.
1, safety lid. Watch this. They come
No
in
water
like
coming
this.
out.
That's because I just cleaned my cup. It's because I cleaned my cup. Water, but look, watch this. No water coming out. Let me display this.
Okay, wait. Can
Then,
you not put your hand on the top?
You lock it just for safety. Or you say, I need a little handle for my dainty index finger. Okay?
My dainty.
Then, okay, open it up. It pops open. Okay? Oh, that was good. Then, you have a little sipping straw. See like this?
Girl? Clearly yes. But does she have one flaw? Yes, she does. But no, it does not bother me. So maybe she has some spillage. I'm not putting it anywhere where it's gonna be upside down. So I really don't care that it spills, but I know the day will come when I want one that I can travel with or just throw in my bag. People are saying Brewmate is the Stanley that doesn't leak. First of all, nothing compares to a Stanley, but let's just test it. Okay. Then you lock it.
This is your sign to get rid of all of your Stanley.
People have been turning to these water bottles because of the deficiencies in the Stanley. Number one, people say that the Stanley leaks. Like if you spill it or knock it over, it leaks from the straw compartment. The hydro jug doesn't do that. I've also heard people talk about how the Stanley is hard to clean and there can be mold buildup. Both of these things are valid criticisms. Let's not get it twisted. People also didn't like how the straws were constantly exposed in the Stanley, and that's one of the reasons why people went to the Awala. And both of these mugs, both of these new drinking vessels don't really solve all of the problems. Also, I'm just going to circle back to the lead here. I haven't really heard anybody buying any of these mugs because of the lead. It's all of this other stuff that I mentioned. And to be clear, the Awala and the hydro jug, both of them don't prevent spilling. The hydro jug still has the straw exposed, and both of them are still going to have a cleaning that's required and pieces that can be hard to clean. Neither of these is inherently, like, there are still difficulties embedded with both of these products in cleaning. So neither of these solve that problem. The Stanley has never been a perfect water bottle. And the thing is that people knew this going into the Stanley, or people didn't think about practicality when they were buying the Stanley because it was never about the Stanley. People understood these problems when they bought their second, third, or fourth Stanley because it was never about the Stanley. We now have reasons to overconsume and overbuy alternative water bottles. That is what's happening. People are exchanging one water bottle for another, and not just one-for-one replacements. People are throwing out or getting rid of all 5 of their Stanleys or all 20 of their Stanleys, and they're replacing them with the newest model of water bottle, the newest girl in town. It was never about the water bottle. It was about the symbolism and what these things meant to us, what these things meant in the cultural zeitgeist, how these things reflected our current cultural moment, our desire for it girl status and wealth or aesthetics. And once the aesthetics change, then we consume something else. Now the it girl owns the Awala. I want to add in a few thoughts before we close out this video. This video has really focused on over-consuming what is a micro trend, because even if the Stanley has been popular for 2 years, 2 years is still short enough to be considered a micro trend, even if now we work with even smaller time frame. Falling for micro trends or participating in micro trends is not something that is exclusively happening to women. Today, we're talking about a trend of the Stanley in which women tend to be overrepresented in. I want to make it very clear, this is not something that is perpetuated exclusively by women. With this specific trend, influencers play a huge role in fanning the flames of consumer desires. not only because they're encouraging people to use them or they're making them look cool via their influencer status, but because they're selling these products. Influencers have had a vested interest in hyping up the Stanley because they were selling them and their accessories. They had a vested interest in making them look cool or to be an it girl product because they were selling them and they made money off of you viewing those products in that way. They are also contributing to the switch from the Stanley to other water bottles. HydroJug has been the biggest problem in this area because they are sponsoring. HydroJug is sponsoring influencer posts on TikTok. Some of the videos we saw today are actually HydroJug sponsorships. And these sponsorships are also going undisclosed or difficult to detect with the disclosure happening below the fold on TikTok. The Stanley rose to prominence and fell from grace, and neither of these happened because of the product category itself. I do think that because this item is practical, it helped people justify buying it or participating in what is a trend. So I think that there was some mental ease that came with the Stanley, but it didn't become so popular or become so overconsumed because of the item. And we see this time and time again, that the Stanley is just a cog in the consumer's machine. It's the latest item in the micro trend. It's the latest thing for us to overconsume, aestheticize, in some ways fetishize maybe, but aestheticize and symbolize. Consumer culture and materialism will find a new symbol. It will find a new item because it always does. There will be something new next week or next year to venerate and overhype, and it's already happening. I hope that this video kind of showed you just a little bit about the consumer culture behind the Stanley. I don't personally care what water bottle you drink out of, and I hope that whatever you drink, you enjoy. But this video was not intended to be a shit on those who enjoy the Stanley. It's a commentary about the consumer culture that emerges behind things like the Stanley. How we can get carried away and how we can fall into this desire for being an it girl and believe in the aesthetics and want things for the aesthetics and buy them, and then we forget about them in 2, let alone 5 years. Thanks so much for watching. I would love to hear your opinion on the Stanley. Not so much the aesthetics of it, but the consumer culture behind it. Did I say thank you for watching? Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again around here soon. Bye.